Okay, great. That's wonderful. I mean, that's more important. Thank you so much, Durham University, for inviting me. Um, I just visited Durham long years ago in 1990 to visit some friends when I was studying law in England at that time, and I have very fond memories of the university and the campus. And I really wanted to be there myself, but the court work didn't allow me to be there, and it's a personal loss for being here online. I hope you can hear me and I can just get started. I just want to, be very clear at the beginning that I want to bring a perspective on the table here from a judge of the Supreme Court of the Global South. And I underline Global South because I think there's a lot of voice that needs to come onto the table from the Global South, of the judiciaries from the Global South, and I think that's missing in the equation, and I'll explain as I go on. So here are some ideas and some innovations that judges from the Global South are doing to make this just transition that we're talking about. So let me just start off by saying that when I look at the conference materials that were sent to me, I see that perhaps it is written that climate justice is perceived to be a goal of just transition. I take that to be just transition where the government or the executive is doing that just transition. And in that sense, yes, while doing that just transition, I think it's fundamentally based on climate justice. But judiciary perceives it, or at least judges in the South perceive just transition differently. We think that it is the judiciary that's driving climate justice, and it is through climate justice and through court intervention that we achieve just transition. So as if the ultimate goal is just transition, and climate justice is the medium that the judiciary is using to achieve climate justice. So I think the equation gets reversed when the judiciary takes up the matter of climate justice and then pushes and actualizes just transition. So I wanted to make that clear, and some of the cases that I'll refer to later establishes that the driving force is the court through the methodology of climate justice to achieve just transition. And I wanted to put that order right in my understanding. That's how it is. So the court curates right-based remedies to achieve climate justice, which leads to just transition. So the ultimate goal is just transition when it comes to the judiciary. I also want to say that as far as Global South is concerned, there is in fact a total inertia on the part of the government or the executive to do just transition on their own. And or at times the transition is not just enough. And therefore the courts have stepped in and intervened to promote and encourage just transition. This has been the premier kind of role of courts in the Global South under the banner of public environmental interest litigation, and more so in Pakistan, in the region. So climate justice, therefore, to us largely falls in the lap of the judiciary. And that is particularly the case in Pakistan. And I want to share some of the ideas in that context. And that is because the governments do not take interest in taking that just transition on their own because of number of vested interests that might be involved. There might be compromises which are political in nature, and perhaps that's the reason that people reach out to more independent, neutral medium, which is the judiciary. And judiciary has been very successful in pushing the rights of the people through, rather than the governments doing that. So when we talk about, Dharam talks about, world-leading expertise in researching the causes and impacts of climate change, or with the aim to develop a world-leading interdisciplinary work program to research sustainable and just solutions for accelerated decarbonization of economies and the things in order to reach the net zero, I say you have to additionally have this climate obligation to provide solutions to 6 billion people who are in the South, the Global South, and which are being impacted by the climate change. So that is something that I want to underline, that I want to plead the case here of the 6 billion people who are affected by the impact of climate change. So when we talk about just transition, as I understand from the literature, it is mitigation related. It's a global north issue of reducing emissions. And that's the context and that's the frame in which we're looking at just transition. I think it's larger than that. And you'll have to bring into the equation of just transition adaptation rather than mitigation. You have to make it more inclusive just transition, where you need to bring in adaptation, because in our countries, reduction of emissions is not an issue. We are insignificant when it comes to emissions. But on the other hand, there's a serious problem when we talk about climate change impacts on our country or our countries in the South, which therefore the climate justice context has to be understood. And I think there's a clear division in understanding climate justice. For the global North means something else. For global South, it means something totally different. So for global North, it might be reduction in emissions and meeting international standards. That's fine. Nothing wrong with that. But global South doesn't perceive it that way. We look at restructuring, rebuilding, realigning societies to adjust to the challenges of climate change. It's a far broader canvas that we're looking at. It's not simply making sure that the government follows standards. We are looking at a multi-sectoral problem where we look trying to adapt to changing climate. And so climate justice here has a multidimensional scope, and I'll just try to explain. So the word adaptation for us would be, or focuses on managing impacts of climate change that are already happening and are unavoidable. So as far as the judges or the climate justice in the context of global South is concerned, we have following principles to follow. For example, equity. We recognize that while there are countries contributing to climate change, there are others which are simply being affected by it. This acknowledges that it is the developed nations that have largely contributed to the greenhouse gas emissions, while South, for no contribution of theirs, are at the suffering end. So there's an equity issue that we need to understand. We perceive it as a human rights framework. In the context of human rights framework, we see that climate justice frames climate change as a human rights issue, focusing on the rights to a safe environment, the right to life, food, water, vulnerable groups, including indigenous communities, low-income populations, and future generations are often prioritized. So the scope changes. We also believe on accountability here, because holding governments, corporations, and other entities responsible for their actions or inactions that exacerbate climate change for us, suggesting ways to move forward, building a climate resilient country. So that's the focus we are going through. So just transition refers to, as I understand so far in the literature, is limited to the process of shifting from high carbon, unsustainable economic systems towards more sustainable, low carbon models, while ensuring that the workers, communities, and industries affected by these changes are not left behind. It is a holistic framework that looks at the economic, social, and environmental impacts of transitioning towards a green economy. Transition is therefore commonly associated in the global North with mitigation. In its original form, just transition did not address adaptation, you see. So this is because the concept arose primarily in industrialized nations. So I want to bring that on the table. So when we look at, my input today would be that we need to revisit the term just transition and expand the concept of just transition to include adaptation. Climate discourse evolves. There's a growing recognition that adaptation must be part of the just transition framework, particularly in countries where climate justice is centered on the need to adapt to unavoidable impacts. In these countries, the focus isn't just on reducing emissions, but on ensuring communities can survive and thrive in a world where climate change is already affecting their daily lives. It is therefore essential that just transition must include both mitigation and adaptation strategies. This inclusive just transition, so that we make just transition, we don't ignore lives of 6 billion people of the global South who are seriously challenged and threatened by the climate change. So several countries in the global South now have a serious adaptation focus. For example, you take India, there are climate risks. India is one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, facing a wide array of risks: heat waves, floods, droughts, rising sea levels. The agriculture sector, which employs nearly half the population, is particularly vulnerable to these changes, and they're not emitting in that sense. Adaptation as a primary concern for these countries, for India. Then I move on to Bangladesh. Climate risks. Bangladesh is one of the countries most affected by climate change, facing frequent floods, cyclones, rising sea levels. Approximately 80% of the country's population lives in flood-prone areas, and sea level rise threatens large portions of the country's coastal regions. They too have an adaptation policy, which they're trying to implement. Take Pakistan for that matter. Pakistan faces significant climate-related challenges, and I'll talk about Pakistan in a little more, including water scarcity, extreme heat, flooding. The country's geography makes it particularly vulnerable to glacial melt, desertification, and sea level rise. We have a climate change policy, and increasingly the climate jurisprudence that's coming out of Pakistan is a very adaptive jurisprudence, which I wanted to underline, and I want that to be now a part of just transition rather than just a mitigational set of jurisprudence which comes out of the north. Then Indonesia, and I keep mentioning Philippines for that matter, they are all facing these problems. So now, having said that, now let me just share with you that a judge in Pakistan who's sitting in a global south, how does he address climate justice in the context of just transition? So some of the suggestions, some of the inputs on how we look at and view this area. For example, for the as a first item, judges must understand the history, geography, and contemporary issues of their countries. Now, as far as Pakistan is concerned, we have a population of 240 million people. Pakistan has a negligible contribution to GHGs, yet it is 8th most affected country due to climate change. Climate change has led to, in Pakistan, extreme weather events, erratic monsoon rains, and the devastating flood 2 years ago is global news. Floods, droughts, recession of glaciers, rising temperature resulting in agricultural productivity, threats to coastal areas due to projected sea level rise, increased health risks, and induced migration and human displacement. Now, these are huge set of issues which Pakistan is facing. Emissions is not our problem. These are our problems on the table, and these problems come to court. So when we talk about major survival concerns for Pakistan would be water security, food security, energy security. Climate change, therefore, is the most serious existential threat that Pakistan faces. Am I being heard? Is everything okay? Can you all hear me? Sorry?
I just want to cover, can Dr. Shah make questions?
Yes. So yes, we can clearly hear you. This is, and so
you can hear
me. Yes, you can hear you. So if this
okay,
mic is out, it will make extra noise. When you're away from
okay, thank you.
And close to the
Okay, so I'll continue. So, as I said, Pakistan also faces some of the highest disaster risk levels in the world, ranking 23rd out of 194 countries as per the 2024 Inform Risk Index. So adaptation is that capacity and potential for humans to adapt, called the adaptive capacity, and is unevenly distributed across different regions and populations, and developing countries generally have less capacity to adapt. We're not so able to even deal with disasters that much. So having said that, I just wanted to, first point that I wanted to make was that just transition must be more inclusive, including adaptive strategies, looking at the countries from global south. I also want to now underline that climate justice to us has a number of intersections, which might not be so available, maybe or maybe not in the north. So the canvas again expands a little more. For example, climate change and poverty has a direct intersection as far as our countries are concerned. So poor communities, especially in developing countries, are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change because they often live in areas more susceptible to extreme weather events such as floods, droughts, and storms. They lack the financial resources to recover from disaster, which I want to underline, because we've had a major flood 2 years ago and we're still recovering from it. There's been no international support. So talking about climate funding and loss and damage, that's all a dream. Nothing comes through. The cost was about $30 billion, and I don't think anything has trickled in. So the country has to deal with it on its own. So they lack financial resources to recover from disasters, build climate resilient infrastructure, or access essential services during climate-induced crisis. And mind you, all of these are human rights cases, and they would come to the court, and the court has to address them. So, I'm trying to put that on the table. Many low-income populations depend on agriculture. It's a largely an agricultural country. Climate change disrupts agricultural productivity through changing rainfall patterns, droughts and extreme weather, leading to food insecurity and loss of income. This deepens poverty cycles. Then we have a major intersection between climate change and women, you see. Women, especially, and mind you, our demographics, 51% of our population are women in Pakistan. So women, especially in developing countries in general, are disproportionately affected by climate change due to existing gender inequalities. They often bear the brunt of responsibilities like securing water, food, and fuel for their families, all of which become harder to access as climate impacts worsens. As crops fail due to drought or floods, the economic security of women is threatened. They can lead to forced migration, human trafficking, and even forced marriages. I mean, these are the consequences of climate change. Climate change increases health risks that proportionally affect women, such as vector-borne diseases like malaria, and etc., and pregnancy complications due to heat stress. The next intersection I want to talk about is climate change and child justice. Children and climate change has a major impact in our country. Children are one of the most vulnerable groups affected by climate change. They face greater health risks, including malnutrition, infectious diseases, and exposure to extreme events. So climate-induced disasters often lead to school closures, particularly in regions already struggling with access to education. In rural areas, children may also be pulled out of school to help their families recover from climate-related shocks, perpetuating cycles of poverty and limiting future opportunities. Children may be forced into labor to support household income. Climate change also heightens risk of child trafficking, exploitation, and forced migration in areas where children are particularly vulnerable. Climate change also has a serious intersection with health in our country in particular. Climate change increases the frequency and intensity of heat waves, leading to a rise in heat-related illnesses and deaths, particularly among vulnerable groups such as elderly and children, and those with pre-existing health conditions. Rising temperatures and shifting weather patterns expand the range of vector-borne diseases such as malaria and dengue fever. Flooding can also lead to spread of waterborne diseases like droughts, and lack of clean water exacerbate sanitation issues. Psychological impact of climate change, such as anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress, are increasingly recognized as mental health issues in our country. So climate change disrupts food security, leading to malnutrition, particularly in regions that rely on subsistence farming. Then we have climate refugees and migration and displacement, which I earlier mentioned a little. So it is significant to note that these are many facets to climate justice that we encounter and we face. So if a normal case were to come to a court in Pakistan, it has in it a number of dimensions which the judge needs to discover and unfold. The complainant might not be able to articulate all these issues, but all these issues are on the table when it comes to dispensing justice, when you're talking about human rights. So I'm just trying to, paint a picture where a judge sitting in the global south attending to climate justice, he's looking at a different ball game. It's not just emissions and reducing emissions. It's not that linear. There is a lot to it. Moving on, I just two cases that I want to refer to where we've done that, and we've tried to push the government to go ahead and implement these policies and do something about it. That's been the role of the court. We do not create policy, but if there is a climate adaptation policy on the shelf, which the government is not doing anything about it, we push the government to do that because we think that human rights demands that, and our jurisdiction, which is to enforce human rights, demands that. So you must have heard of the Asghar Laghari case is one example where a policy on the shelf was lying, unattended, and the court went ahead and pushed it. And the court used a medium of forming commissions and pushed the agenda through them. And the idea was that there has to be some intervention by the government to arrive at a just transition, to attend to droughts, to attend to flooding, to attend to agriculture, to attend to forestry, to attend to all sorts of multi-sectoral issues. And I don't need to take you through that case. I'm sure some people must have read about it. And that's one major case that gets it started. And while we start and talk about Asghar Laghari, we also talk about water justice, because Pakistan's biggest issue would be water. Today it's a water scarce country, and it's going to augment in future, unfortunately. So water justice comes at the heart of climate justice for Pakistan. So any climate justice case in Pakistan, if it does not attending to, it has to sooner or later relate to water justice, has to be attended to. Similarly, in a DG Cement case, where a cement plant was being set up in a water scarce area in a valley, the court interfered and said, no, you cannot go ahead with this expansion of setting up a cement plant. As you all understand, that cement plants are water guzzlers, and in a water scarce country, in a water scarce area, which area relies on subsistence farming, if you allow the expansion of a cement plant, that is not a climate resilient policy and not a climate resilient step, which directly impacts human rights in the area. So we stopped the cement plant from the construction of the cement plant in the area, because we thought that would directly affect, that was something, a climate change issue, and would affect the country's resources. So the country, it's an interesting read, and I don't want to go through the case in detail. I don't have that time. But I want to point out that while doing this, there are other innovations that the court also brought. There was this principle which was in the soft law called the in dubio pro natura, which says, when in doubt, protect nature. Now, this was a soft law. We picked it up and we brought it in the judgment, and now it becomes part of the land. So it's like a variant of precautionary principle, and we've introduced that in the DG Cement case. Then we've also talked about democracies being climate democracies, because it is so essential that no governance structure can be built in Pakistan which does not attend to climate. So our democracies, which, if we call them robust democracies, they need to factor in climate. And so we kind of coined the term climate democracy, that they must consider this as an important point. We also, in this judgment, talked about intergenerational justice, that if we are going to sort of not safeguard and protect the resources today and attend to these resources and protect them against the rigors of climate change, then what do we leave for future generations? And also, there was a voice given to the legal personhood of nature, and that was very important, that nature must now have a voice in the court too, because the way things are happening in the country. Number of cases that go ahead, we also talked about urban planning. There's another case where the Supreme Court of Pakistan talked about urban planning and how sustainability, adaptation, and climate resiliency has to be built into our future urban development plans, how you build buildings, how you build roads. There has to be climate resiliency in all these areas as you go along, because you can't otherwise attend to this. Then we go ahead, in a recent case, we talked about, and sometimes we felt that we writing all these judgments and all this jurisprudence is being produced. Are we really reaching out to people? Is it making an impact on people or not? So we thought there's another intersection that we're missing, and that we introduced in this case. And we said, we need to see, what does our religion say? If we can connect by bringing religion into climate justice and have that intersection, maybe we can talk to people more effectively. Maybe our judgments get followed more effectively, because they think it's not a fancy concept that we're trying to talk about in the jurisprudence, but we're actually talking about the wisdom and ethos which come out of the religion itself. 98% of the country being Muslims, it will be very easy to touch them through through religion. And it was interesting when I went ahead and studied this area, and we found that there is so much in Islam about environmental constitutionalism. So we introduced that in this recent case, that the entire new term is environmental constitutionalism, which largely hinges on religion. And we would notice that our holy book, I would very conveniently say, but largely talks about environmental principles, which I thought would very easily be communicated, so that if the end result is that we need to arrive at some sort of compliance, I need to reach out to people. You see, I can't just leave it to fancy concepts. Why can't I reach out through my own religion? So we found that there were deep, within Islamic environmentalism, there were deep linkages to environment in this. And so I've just referred to Syed Mansoor, a major Islamic philosopher, who criticizes the modern secular worldview for what he perceives as a harmful attitude towards nature. He believes that current ecological crisis is a spiritual problem rooted in the forgetfulness of the sacred nature of the world. He argues that modernity has led to an exploitative and instrumentalist view of nature, contributing to environmental degradation. Can provide a comprehensive approach to environmental issues encompassing ethical, social, economic, and political dimensions. So just to refer to a few, I can't go on the whole thing. For example,
if I may interrupt,
sure.
Waiting for your talk to be ended in 1 minute, please.
Okay, so I'll just conclude that we've just also gone ahead and stressed a lot on human dignity. We are now talking about a very biocentric approach towards climate change rather than an anthropogenic approach. We are talking about human dignity of nature, because we believe that if we were to protect the dignity of nature, we protect nature, we protect humans. So that's the kind of flow that the court is going through. And so I guess largely I'm done. I'm open to any questions that might happen. So this is the flow that Pakistani judges or judges in the South are looking at, and that's how we're perceiving climate justice. Thank you so much.